Well, I'll be hornswoggled. In 30 years of driving school buses through the back roads of East Tennessee, Jake Rivers had seen his share of critters blocking the highway. Deer, possums, even the occasional black bear. But never a bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, standing dead center in the middle of Route 441 like she owned the place. The little thing wasn't running, wasn't scared. Just sitting there, staring right at him with those golden eyes, like she had something important to say. Jake eased the empty bus to a stop, hazard lights blinking. Through his radio, the dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency. All units, severe weather warning. Major storm system moving in. Estimated arrival 4 hours. 4 hours. That's when he noticed it. A red light blinking on the kitten's leg, some kind of device. Emergency signal. His blood ran cold. Somewhere out there, someone was running out of time. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake cut the engine and stepped out into the humid August air. The little bobcat didn't move, just kept those intelligent eyes fixed on him like she was sizing him up. In all his born days, he'd never seen a wildcat act like she had something important to say. "Easy there, little lady," he murmured, keeping his distance. Years of police work before he'd taken this bus driving job had taught him to read situations, and this one had his instincts screaming. The red light on her leg blinked steadily. Definitely some kind of GPS tracker, but not the kind he'd seen on regular wildlife. His radio crackled again. "Unit 47, we've got Dr. Sarah Clearwater en route to your location. Wildlife specialist. ETA 15 minutes. Jake acknowledged, but his attention stayed on the kitten. She'd started making soft sounds now, not quite meowing, more like pleading. Lord have mercy, if that didn't sound like she was trying to tell him something urgent. The wind picked up, rustling the oak trees that lined the highway. Dark clouds were building on the horizon, and Jake could smell rain coming. His late wife Betty used to say, "Sometimes angels come in the strangest packages, Jake. You just gotta have eyes to see them." When Dr. Clearwater's white pickup pulled up behind his bus, Jake felt a measure of relief. She was a small woman, maybe 45, with the kind of steady hands and calm voice that came from years of dealing with wild animals. "That's not standard wildlife equipment," she said, after examining the kitten through binoculars. "GPS tracker says B Whitehorse emergency. Ring any bells?" Jake shook his head, but something nagged at him. Whitehorse. Why did that name sound familiar? "Whispering Pines Wildlife Sanctuary is about 10 miles east," Sarah continued. "They do rehabilitation work there. Bobcats, mostly." The little creature suddenly stood up and took several deliberate steps toward the tree line, then stopped and looked back at them. The message was clear as day. "Well, ain't that something?" Jake muttered. "She wants us to follow her." Sarah checked her watch. "Storm's coming fast. If someone's really in trouble out there." She trailed off, but they both knew what she meant. In 3.5 hours, these back roads would be flooded. Whatever window they had for a rescue was closing fast. The bobcat kitten took another few steps toward the woods, then sat down and waited, as patient as a saint. Jake made his decision. "Ma'am, I've been wrong about plenty of things in my life, but I don't think I'm wrong about this. That little one's trying to save somebody." 6 months earlier, the mountain roads around Whispering Pines had been quiet except for the rumble of logging trucks and the occasional tourist heading to Gatlinburg. Benjamin Whitehorse had been making his evening rounds, checking the perimeter fences of the wildlife sanctuary, when he heard the sound that would change everything, the desperate mewing of something very small and very alone. The old Vietnam veteran moved through the underbrush with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned to walk quietly in dangerous places. At 67, Ben still carried himself like the soldier he'd once been, though the weight of too much loss had bent his shoulders and carved deep lines around his eyes. He found her beside the twisted wreckage of what had once been her mother, a full-grown bobcat that had been struck by a logging truck and dragged nearly 50 yards off the main road. The kitten couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, eyes barely open, mewing pitifully as she tried to nurse from her dead mother. "Well, now," Ben whispered, kneeling beside the tiny creature, "what are we going to do with you?" The question hung in the mountain air like morning mist. Standard protocol was clear. Orphaned wildlife should be taken to the state facility in Knoxville, where they had proper equipment and staff. But something about the kitten's determined little cries reminded him so powerfully of his son Michael that his chest tightened with familiar grief. Michael, his boy, who'd been so good with animals, who'd planned to be a veterinarian before the army called and Afghanistan took him away forever. 2 years now since the knock on the door, since the flag-draped coffin, since Ben's world had cracked clean through the middle. "Michael always said animals were better than people," Ben murmured to the kitten as he gently wrapped her in his jacket. "Guess he was right. This little one, she listens better than most folks I know." Back at the sanctuary, Ben set up a makeshift nursery in his office, bottle feeding every 2 hours, monitoring her temperature, staying up through the long nights when she cried for the mother who would never come. His colleagues thought he was getting too attached, warned him about the dangers of imprinting, reminded him that their job was to rehabilitate and release, not to create pets. But as the weeks passed and the kitten grew stronger, Ben found himself talking to her the way he used to talk to Michael when the boy was small, about the mountains, about the changing seasons, about the difference between the tracks of a coyote and those of a dog. "You're getting too soft, old man," Dr. Patricia Freeman, the sanctuary director, had warned him one morning. She'd found Ben teaching the kitten. He'd started calling her Luna because of the white crescent marking on her forehead, to respond to hand signals. "She's smart, Pat," Ben had replied, watching Luna sit perfectly still at his raised fist. "Smarter than any bobcat I've ever worked with. Look at this." He'd walked to the far side of his office and called her name softly. Luna had trotted over immediately, weaving between his legs like a house cat, seeking affection. "That's not wild behavior, Ben," Patricia had said, though her voice was gentle. "You know that. The longer you keep her, the harder it's going to be to release her." Ben knew she was right, but every time he looked at Luna, he saw Michael's eyes. The same intelligence, the same trust, the same absolute faith that the world was fundamentally good, despite all evidence to the contrary. The boy had been like that right up until the end, writing letters from Kandahar about the stray dogs he and his unit had adopted, about the children who waved at their convoys, about his plans to come home and help his father with the sanctuary. Those letters had stopped coming on a Tuesday in March, replaced by a chaplain's solemn visit, and a silence that had stretched on for 2 years. "She's learning things she shouldn't learn," Patricia had continued. "Following you around like a dog, coming when called, seeking human contact. That's not rehabilitation, Ben. That's domestication." But Ben had discovered something remarkable about Luna. She seemed to understand the difference between work and play, between the sanctuary and the wild world beyond its fences. During training exercises, she moved through the forest like the predator she was born to be. She could track, hunt, and hide with all the skill of her wild cousins. But when Ben called her back, she came. "Roads mean help," he'd started teaching her during their longer expeditions. "If you're ever lost, if you're ever scared, remember, roads mean people, and people mean help." It was a lesson born from his military training, where lost soldiers were taught to find civilization by following infrastructure. But with Luna, it became something else, a bridge between her wild instincts and the human world that had taken her in. The breakthrough had come during a training exercise 3 months ago. Ben had been testing Luna's hunting skills in the deep woods when he'd suffered what the doctors later called a minor cardiac event, heart palpitations that left him disoriented and weak. He'd sat down against a tree to rest, and Luna had immediately come to his side, pressing her warm body against his chest as if she could somehow steady his racing heart. When he'd felt better and tried to stand, Luna had done something extraordinary. She'd walked deliberately to the nearest logging road, sat down and looked back at him with unmistakable intent. "You want me to follow you to the road," he'd said, more to himself than to her. "You think the road means safety." She'd waited until he reached her, then had escorted him all the way back to the sanctuary, never leaving his side, occasionally looking up at his face as if checking to make sure he was all right. That night, lying in his narrow bed in the staff quarters, Ben had made a decision that went against every protocol in the book. He'd started teaching Luna advanced search and rescue techniques, not for her benefit, but for his. The mountains were dangerous places, and an old man living alone in the wilderness needed all the help he could get. He taught her to recognize distress signals, to understand the difference between normal human activity and emergency situations. He'd even rigged up a simple GPS tracker, the same kind search and rescue teams use for their dogs, with his emergency contact information. "If something ever happens to me out there," he'd told Luna during one of their training sessions, "you go to the road, you stay on the road until someone stops. You don't leave until they understand you need help." He'd practiced the scenario dozens of times, hiking deep into the wilderness and then pretending to be injured. Every time, Luna had performed flawlessly, staying with him initially, then making the journey to the nearest road when he gave her the signal. His colleagues would have been horrified if they'd known. Using a rehabilitation animal for personal protection was not just against protocol, it was potentially harmful to the animal's chances of successful release. But Ben had convinced himself that Luna was different, that she could bridge the gap between wild and domestic in ways that no one had imagined. The truth was simpler and more painful. Luna had become his lifeline to a world that had taken his son away. Every day with her was another day he didn't have to face the crushing silence of his grief alone. Now, as storm clouds gathered over the Tennessee mountains and Luna sat on a highway trying to lead strangers into the wilderness, Ben lay trapped beneath a fallen tree, conscious enough to understand that his careful training might be the only thing standing between him and death. "Smart girl," he whispered to the empty forest. "Go get help, Luna. Just like we practiced." Jake radioed dispatch to report their location and intention to follow the Bobcat into the woods. The response wasn't encouraging. Backup was tied up with storm preparations, and the nearest search and rescue team was dealing with a multi-car accident on the interstate. They were on their own for at least 2 hours, maybe more. "Time's a-wasting, and this little gal's trying to save someone," Jake said to Sarah as he shouldered a small emergency pack from his bus. Years of police work had taught him to keep basic supplies handy: flashlight, first aid kit, emergency blankets, water. Sarah hesitated, checking her phone for the third time. No signal this far out in the mountains. What if we're walking into something dangerous? What if whoever's out there got hurt doing something they shouldn't have been doing? Jake looked at the Bobcat kitten, who had moved another 20 yards toward the tree line, and sat down again, patient as a church deacon waiting for service to start. "Then we walk into it together. That's what decent folks do." The first 100 yards into the forest were easy enough, a well-worn deer trail that wound between towering pines and old-growth hardwoods. Luna stayed just ahead of them, occasionally looking back to make sure they were following, but moving with purpose and confidence. This wasn't a lost animal wandering aimlessly. This was a creature with a destination in mind. "Look at how she moves," Sarah observed, breathing hard as the trail began to climb. "That's not random wild behavior. Someone's worked with her before." Jake nodded, though his attention was divided between watching Luna and scanning the forest around them. Something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs. No rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. They'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when Luna suddenly stopped and crouched low, her ears flattened against her head. A low growl rumbled in her throat, not directed at them, but at something ahead. "What's got her spooked?" Jake whispered, automatically reaching for the service weapon he no longer carried. Old habits. Sarah pulled out her binoculars and scanned the woods ahead. "There," she said quietly, "about 50 yards up the trail, some kind of metal contraption." Jake borrowed the binoculars and felt his stomach clench. Leg-hold traps, the kind that had been illegal in Tennessee for over a decade. Cruel devices designed to capture and hold animals until the trapper returned. But these weren't set for small game. They were positioned along what looked like a heavily used animal trail sized for something much larger. "Somebody's been poaching," he said grimly. "Big cats, probably." "There's a black market for bobcat pelts, especially the spotted ones like Luna here." The implications hit them both at the same time. Ben Whitehorse, whoever he was, might not have been the victim of an accident. He might have stumbled onto something illegal and dangerous. Luna had started moving again, but more cautiously now, staying well clear of the trap line. She led them on a wide detour through thicker underbrush, terrain that would have been nearly impossible to navigate without her guidance. "She knows where these traps are," Sarah said, wonder creeping into her voice. "She's been through here before, and she's learned to avoid them." They found the first sign of human presence about a quarter-mile past the trap line, a small clearing where the undergrowth had been trampled down and several trees showed fresh cuts. Hidden cameras were mounted in the branches, the kind used for wildlife observation, but pointed in directions that suggested they were monitoring the illegal trap line rather than studying animal behavior. Jake examined one of the cameras while Sarah kept watch. "This is professional setup," he said. "Whoever's running this operation has money and knowledge. This isn't some yahoo with a couple of traps." Luna had grown increasingly agitated as they'd moved through the clearing. She paced back and forth, making soft, whimpering sounds that tugged at something deep in Jake's chest. This little creature was carrying a burden that no animal should have to bear. The knowledge that someone she cared about was in terrible danger. "Easy, girl," he murmured, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to find him. I promise you that." The words brought back memories he'd tried to bury. 3 years ago, kneeling beside another young creature in distress, Tommy Whitehorse, bleeding out on a classroom floor, while Jake held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. A 24-year-old school resource officer who'd thrown himself between a gunman and a classroom full of third graders. "Officer Rivers," Tommy had whispered as the paramedics worked frantically around them. "Tell my dad. Tell him I tried to do what was right." Jake had held the young man's hand as the light faded from his eyes, had made promises he couldn't keep, had carried the weight of those final moments for 3 long years. The guilt ate at him daily. If he'd been faster getting back from his coffee break, if he'd been in the hallway instead of the teacher's lounge, if he'd been doing his job instead of chatting with the principal about weekend fishing plans. Now, following this determined little bobcat through dangerous terrain, Jake felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Someone was counting on him again, and this time he wouldn't fail. They found blood 20 minutes later, drops on fallen leaves, smears on tree bark where someone had passed by in obvious distress. The trail was easy enough to follow, even for Jake's civilian skills, but it was Luna who led them unerringly toward whatever lay ahead. The storm was getting closer. Jake could hear thunder rolling across the mountains, still distant but approaching fast. The wind had picked up, sending leaves swirling around them and making the tall pines creak ominously overhead. "We need to move faster," Sarah said, checking her watch. That storm hits, we're all in trouble." But even as they increased their pace, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times he caught movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that didn't quite belong to the swaying trees. His police instincts screamed warnings, but Luna pressed forward with single-minded determination, and he found himself trusting her judgment more than his own fears. The sound reached them before they saw anything. A human voice, weak and intermittent, calling for help. Luna's ears perked up immediately, and she broke into a run toward the sound. They found the ravine just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. It was a steep-sided gully, maybe 30 feet deep, carved by generations of mountain runoff. At the bottom, barely visible beneath the branches of a massive fallen oak, was a human figure. "Hello, down there?" Jake called. "Can you hear me?" The response was immediate but weak. "Help! Trapped! Can't feel my legs!" Luna had already found a way down, picking her path carefully along the rocky slope. She reached the bottom and immediately went to the trapped man, pressing her small body against his side in a gesture of pure comfort and loyalty. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake breathed. "She led us right to him." As they prepared to descend into the ravine, neither Jake nor Sarah noticed the figure watching them from the ridge above, or the way he spoke quietly into a radio before melting back into the forest like smoke. The man trapped beneath the fallen oak was conscious, but badly hurt. Jake and Sarah made their way carefully down the steep ravine, using tree roots and rocky outcroppings for handholds. Luna had positioned herself protectively beside him, her small body providing what warmth she could. "Sir, I'm Jake Rivers, and this is Dr. Sarah Clearwater," Jake called as they approached. "We're here to help. Can you tell me your name?" "Benjamin. Ben Whitehorse," came the weak reply. "Luna, she found you. Good girl." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach at the name, but he pushed the feeling aside. Right now, this man needed medical attention, not questions about why the name Whitehorse made his chest tighten with old grief. Sarah immediately began her assessment. "Looks like both legs are pinned, possible spinal injury. We can't move him without proper equipment." She looked up at the darkening sky as thunder rolled closer. "And we can't leave him here with this storm coming." As she worked, Ben managed to tell them what had happened. He'd been documenting the illegal trap line with a hidden camera when he'd been discovered. 2 men had chased him through the woods, and in his flight he'd stumbled into this ravine just as the old oak, weakened by recent storms, had come crashing down. "They've been running this operation for months," Ben whispered, his voice growing weaker. "Poaching bobcats, selling the pelts out of state. I have evidence in my camera bag." Jake found the bag partially buried under debris. Inside, along with professional photography equipment, was a small digital camera containing dozens of photos and videos. Images of illegal traps, license plates of vehicles, faces of men loading animal carcasses into trucks. But what made Jake's blood run cold were the conversation recordings. "We can't have some old fool bringing the feds down on us," one voice said clearly through the camera's speakers. "This operation's too profitable to risk." "What do you want to do about the old man?" another voice asked. "Accidents happen in these mountains all the time, especially during storms." Sarah looked up from her patient, fear evident in her eyes. "They weren't just chasing him, they were trying to kill him." Ben nodded weakly. "That's why I trained Luna to find help. I knew this day might come." His eyes found the little bobcat, who was still pressed against his side. "She's not just any animal. She was supposed to be my insurance policy." Jake studied the man's weathered face, trying to place where he'd heard the name Whitehorse before. Something about the way Ben's eyes crinkled when he looked at Luna, something about the gentle way he spoke to her despite his pain, triggered a memory that wouldn't quite surface. "Mister," Whitehorse, Jake said carefully. Have we met before? Your name sounds familiar. Ben's eyes focused on Jake with difficulty. Rivers? Jake Rivers? You said your name was Jake Rivers. That's right. A strange expression crossed Ben's face. Pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. You're the officer. You were at Millfield Elementary 3 years ago. The memory hit Jake like a physical blow. Millfield Elementary. The school shooting. Tommy Whitehorse, the young resource officer who died saving children. The funeral where Jake had met grieving family members whose names and faces had blurred together in his own trauma and guilt. Tommy, Jake whispered. Tommy Whitehorse was your son. My youngest, Ben confirmed, tears mixing with the rain that had started falling harder. Thomas Benjamin Whitehorse. He always talked about his partner Jake, said you were the best cop he'd ever known. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Jake gripped a nearby tree branch to steady himself as 3 years of carefully buried grief came rushing back. Tommy, barely 24 years old, throwing himself between a gunman and a classroom full of children. Tommy, bleeding out on a linoleum floor while Jake held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. Tommy, whose last words had been about doing what was right. I was supposed to be there, Jake said, his voice breaking. I was supposed to be in that hallway, not getting coffee in the teacher's lounge. If I'd been doing my job... Son, you stop that right there, Ben said with surprising strength. Tommy never blamed you for anything. He talked about you all the time. Said you taught him everything important about being a real police officer. Said you were like the big brother he never had. Sarah had stopped her medical assessment to listen, understanding that something profound was happening between these two men. Luna seemed to sense it too, looking back and forth between them with those intelligent golden eyes. After Tommy died, Ben continued, I couldn't stay in town anymore. Too many memories. That's when I came up here to the sanctuary, started working with animals because people hurt too much to be around. He looked at Luna. This little one was my way of honoring his memory. Tommy always said animals were better judges of character than most people. Jake knelt beside Ben, rain streaming down his face. I've carried the guilt of losing him for 3 years. I left police work because of it. Couldn't trust myself to protect anyone else. Tommy wouldn't want that, Ben said firmly. He'd want you to know that you made a difference in his life. He became the kind of officer he was because of what you taught him. The sound of voices echoing through the ravine cut their conversation short. Male voices, angry and searching. The poachers had tracked them down. We need to get out of here, Sarah whispered urgently. Now! But Ben couldn't be moved without risking paralysis or death, and the voices were getting closer. Jake made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Doctor, Clearwater, you stay with Mr. Whitehorse. Keep him stable. Luna, you stay with them too. He stood up, checking his emergency pack for anything that might serve as a weapon. I'm going to lead those men away from here. Jake, no, Ben protested. You don't understand what these men are capable of. Maybe not, Jake replied. But I understand what Tommy would have done. And I understand what you did when you trained Luna to find help. Sometimes we have to risk everything to protect the people we care about. As he prepared to climb back up the ravine, Luna suddenly broke away from Ben's side and positioned herself between Jake and the slope. She looked up at him with unmistakable intent, then looked back toward a narrow gap between 2 large boulders that Jake hadn't noticed before. What is it, girl? He whispered. Luna trotted toward the gap, then looked back at him. The message was clear. There was another way out, a way the poachers might not know about. Ben smiled weakly from where he lay. I told you she was smart. Luna knows these mountains better than anyone. She'll get you out safely. The voices were much closer now. Jake had to make a choice, trust his instincts and try to fight, or trust a small bobcat who had already led them this far. He chose trust. "Take care of him," he told Sarah, then followed Luna toward the hidden passage as the first flashlight beams began to probe the edges of the ravine above them. The narrow passage Luna led him through was barely wide enough for a man, carved by centuries of water flow between two massive boulders. Jake had to turn sideways and squeeze through, following the bobcat's shadowy form as she navigated the maze-like terrain with supernatural confidence. Behind them, he could hear the voices of the poachers getting closer to the ravine. "Where the hell did they go?" one voice demanded, echoing off the rock walls. "They're down there somewhere. That old man's got evidence that could put us all away for 20 years. Jake pressed himself against the cold stone, hardly daring to breathe. Through a gap in the rocks, he could see flashlight beams dancing across the ravine floor where Sarah was keeping Ben as quiet and still as possible. If the poachers found them before help arrived, all of their lives would be in danger. Luna had stopped moving and was looking back at him intently. In the dim light filtering through the passage, her eyes seemed to glow with an almost human intelligence. She touched his leg with one paw, then moved deeper into the passage, clearly wanting him to follow. 3 years ago, Jake would have trusted his training, his weapon, his backup. Tonight, in these treacherous mountains with a storm bearing down on them, he was trusting a small, wild animal who seemed to understand things about survival that no academy had ever taught him. The passage opened up into a small cave carved from the mountainside by generations of seasonal flooding. Luna immediately went to what looked like a pile of debris in one corner, pawing at it insistently until Jake realized what she'd found: camping supplies. A sleeping bag, emergency rations, water bottles, and most importantly, a two-way radio. "Well, I'll be damned," Jake whispered. Ben was prepared for this. As he examined the radio, memories flooded back, not just of Tommy's death, but of the months afterward when Jake had slowly self-destructed. The drinking, the sleepless nights, the way he'd isolated himself from everyone who tried to help. He'd resigned from the force not because he was forced to, but because he couldn't stand the weight of his colleagues' sympathy and his own crushing sense of failure. Taking the school bus driving job had been his attempt at finding work where no one's life would depend on his decisions. Simple routes, predictable schedules, no weapons, no split-second choices that could mean the difference between life and death. It had been his way of hiding from the world and from himself, but hiding hadn't healed anything. The guilt had followed him into his new life, coloring every interaction, making him afraid to get close to anyone. He'd convinced himself that he was protecting others by keeping his distance, but really he'd been protecting himself from the possibility of failing someone else the way he'd failed Tommy. The radio crackled to life in his hands. "This is Tennessee Emergency Services. Anyone on this frequency, please respond." Jake keyed the microphone. "This is Jake Rivers. I'm in the mountains east of Route 441 with 2 civilians. We have an injured man trapped in a ravine and hostile individuals in the area. Request immediate assistance." "Copy that, Mr. Rivers. Can you provide coordinates?" Jake looked around helplessly. The GPS tracker on Luna's leg was blinking, but he had no way to read the coordinates. Then he remembered. Ben's camera bag had contained more than just evidence of the poaching operation. "Stand by," he radioed. "I'm going to try to get you a GPS location." Luna seemed to understand that he needed to return to the ravine. She led him back through the passage, but by a different route that brought them out on the opposite side from where the poachers were searching. From this vantage point, Jake could see Sarah still crouched beside Ben, and he could see the 2 men with flashlights systematically working their way down into the ravine. The storm was getting worse. Lightning flashed overhead, followed almost immediately by thunder that shook the ground. The poachers were shouting to each other now, having to raise their voices over the wind and rain. "We don't have much time," one of them called. "If that evidence gets out, we're all going to prison." "Then we make sure it doesn't get out," the other replied grimly. Jake realized with cold certainty that these men weren't just going to threaten Ben. They were prepared to kill all three of them to protect their operation. He'd walked Sarah into mortal danger by following Luna into these mountains. But even as fear threatened to paralyze him, he felt something else stirring. The same protective instinct that had made Tommy throw himself between a gunman and innocent children. The same instinct that had kept Jake in law enforcement for 15 years, despite the dangers and the heartbreak. Maybe he'd failed Tommy by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he wouldn't fail Ben, and he wouldn't fail Sarah, and he sure as hell wouldn't fail this brave little Bobcat who'd risked everything to bring help to someone she loved. Luna had positioned herself at the edge of their hiding spot, watching the scene below with the intense focus of a predator. But Jake could see something in her posture that he'd missed before. She wasn't just alert, she was afraid. This small creature had already witnessed violence in these mountains, had seen Ben attacked and chased, had been forced to leave him behind and seek help from strangers. "You did good, girl," he whispered to her. "You found us, you led us here, and now we're going to make sure Ben gets home safe." As if she understood, Luna looked up at him with those golden eyes and made the softest sound. Not quite a meow, more like a whisper of trust. The radio in Jake's hand crackled again. "Mr. Rivers, we have search and rescue teams mobilizing, but the storm is hampering helicopter operations. Can you maintain your position?" Jake watched one of the poachers moving closer to where Sarah was hidden with Ben. "Negative," he radioed back. "Situation is deteriorating rapidly. We need immediate assistance." That's when Luna did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Jake, then at the poachers below, then back at Jake. Her message was unmistakable. She had a plan. Before Jake could stop her, Luna let out a sound he'd never heard from her before, a wild, piercing call that echoed off the ravine walls like a battle cry. Both poachers immediately turned toward the sound, their flashlights searching the rocks where Luna had been. But she was already moving, bounding from rock to rock with impossible grace, leading the men away from Sarah and Ben and toward the far end of the ravine. She was using herself as bait, drawing the danger away from the people she was trying to protect. "That's Tommy's courage," Jake whispered, understanding suddenly why Ben had been able to train this remarkable animal. "That's pure Tommy right there." The realization hit him like a physical force. Luna wasn't just Ben's insurance policy or his tribute to a dead son. She was living proof that courage and love could survive even the worst tragedies, that the best parts of the people we lose can live on in unexpected ways. As Jake prepared to follow Luna's lead and help draw the poachers away from Ben and Sarah, he felt something shift inside himself. The first real hope he'd experienced in 3 years. Luna's distraction worked perfectly. Both poachers scrambled toward the sound of her call, leaving Sarah and Ben temporarily unguarded. Jake used the opportunity to work his way around the ravine's edge, using the storm's noise to mask his movement. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark, terrifying snapshots. 2 armed men pursuing a small bobcat through treacherous terrain, while an injured man lay helpless below. Jake reached Sarah just as the first poacher's flashlight beam swept dangerously close to their hiding spot. "We need to move him," he whispered urgently. "I don't care about spinal protocols anymore. If we don't get him out of here, he's going to die anyway." Sarah's face was pale, but determined. "His legs are completely pinned. Even if we could free him, I don't think he can feel anything below his waist. Moving him wrong could kill him," Jake finished. "But leaving him here definitely will." Ben's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Jake with effort. Don't risk yourselves for me. I'm an old man. I've lived my life." "Sir, with all due respect, that's not your call to make," Jake replied firmly. "Tommy didn't give up on those kids, and I'm not giving up on you." The mention of his son's name seemed to give Ben a spark of strength. Tommy. He'd want you to be smart about this. There's another way out of this ravine, about 50 yards upstream. Luna showed me once when we were exploring. But you'd have to... His words were cut off by a shout from above. One of the poachers had spotted them. There! Down by the big oak! Gunshots echoed through the ravine as bullets sparked off rocks near their position. Sarah threw herself protectively over Ben while Jake grabbed the largest piece of dead wood he could find, knowing it would be useless against firearms, but needing to feel like he was doing something. That's when Luna reappeared, moving like a golden shadow through the darkness. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, Jake could hear the distant sound of voices, different voices calling out commands and coordinates. The cavalry was finally arriving. "Tennessee State Police! Drop your weapons!" The poachers' flashlights immediately swung away from the ravine floor as they found themselves caught between the approaching officers and the steep drop-off. In the confusion, Luna bounded down to where Ben lay, pressing herself against his chest, as if trying to shield him from the chaos above. "Easy, girl," Ben whispered, managing to raise one trembling hand to stroke her fur. "You did it. You brought them home." Jake looked at the bond between the old man and the Bobcat, and suddenly understood something that had been nagging at him since they'd first started following Luna. This wasn't just about training or animal intelligence. This was about family, the kind of family that transcends species and blood relations. "Mr. Whitehorse," Jake said quietly. "Tommy used to talk about a hunting trip he took with his father when he was 12, said it was the best week of his life because his dad taught him that the woods could be dangerous, but they were also full of wonders if you knew how to look." Ben's eyes filled with tears. "Gobbler's knob. We saw a mother bobcat with her kits that week. Tommy was so excited he could barely contain himself." He looked at Luna, whose golden eyes reflected the lightning flashes. "When I found Luna, all I could think about was that look on Tommy's face, like he'd discovered magic." The gunfire above had stopped, replaced by the sounds of the poachers being taken into custody, but Jake barely heard it. He was lost in a memory that felt like a revelation. Tommy, 3 days before he died, talking about his father's work at the wildlife sanctuary. "My dad's got this theory," Tommy had said, sitting in the patrol car during a quiet moment on their shift. "He thinks animals choose their people just as much as people choose them. Says some bonds go deeper than training or instinct. Says sometimes an animal will save your soul if you let them." At the time, Jake had thought it was just the kind of philosophical talk that cops engaged in during long, boring hours. Now, watching Luna refuse to leave Ben's side despite the chaos around them, he understood that Tommy's father had been talking about something real and profound. The rescue that followed was a blur of professional efficiency. Paramedics rappelled into the ravine with specialized equipment while search and rescue teams established a pulley system to lift Ben safely to ground level. Through it all, Luna stayed close, seeming to understand that her part of the mission was complete but unwilling to abandon her charge until he was truly safe. As they prepared to transport Ben to the helicopter landing zone, he grabbed Jake's arm with surprising strength. "There's something you need to know," he said urgently. "About Tommy. About why he became the kind of officer he was." Jake leaned closer, straining to hear over the storm and the sounds of the rescue operation. "After his brother Michael died in Afghanistan, Tommy was lost," Ben continued. "Angry, directionless, getting into trouble. It was working with you, learning what it meant to serve and protect, that turned him around. You didn't fail him, Jake. You saved him first." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. All these years, he'd carried the guilt of losing Tommy, never knowing that Tommy himself had been lost before they'd ever met. The young man he'd mentored and come to love like a son had found his purpose through their partnership. "He died doing what you taught him," Ben said, his voice growing weaker as the paramedics prepared to sedate him for transport. "He died being the kind of man you showed him how to be. That's not failure, son. That's the greatest gift one person can give another." As the helicopter lifted off with Ben aboard, Jake stood in the rain-soaked forest with Sarah and Luna, watching the aircraft's lights disappear into the storm. The little Bobcat looked up at him, and for a moment Jake could swear he saw Tommy's eyes looking back at him, full of trust, courage, and absolute faith in the goodness of the world. "What happens to her now?" Jake asked Sarah, nodding toward Luna. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the Bobcat who had just orchestrated one of the most remarkable rescues she'd ever witnessed. "I don't think Luna belongs in the wild anymore," she said finally. "But I don't think she belongs in captivity either. I think she belongs wherever she can keep saving people." As they made their way back toward the road, Luna walking confidently ahead of them as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own guilt and fear. Maybe Tommy was gone, and maybe Jake couldn't change that. But Tommy's father was alive because of what they'd done tonight. And Luna, this extraordinary little creature who carried the best parts of 2 lost sons in her brave heart, had shown Jake that love and courage could survive even the worst losses. The storm was finally breaking, and through the clouds, Jake could see the first stars beginning to appear. The ride to the hospital was a blur of rain-slicked roads and emergency vehicles. Jake sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's pickup truck while Luna curled up between them, exhausted from her ordeal but alert to every sound from the radio. The dispatcher's voice crackled with updates. Ben was stable, the poachers were in custody, and the illegal operation had been shut down. But Jake's mind kept drifting back to Ben's words about Tommy, about salvation and failure, and the unexpected ways that love endures. At Knoxville General Hospital, they were directed to a waiting area where the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting created a harsh contrast to the wild drama of the mountains. Luna stayed close to Jake's feet, her presence oddly comforting in the sterile environment. A nurse approached them with forms to fill out and questions about their relationship to the patient. "We're—" Jake began, then stopped. What were they, exactly? "We're the ones who found him, doctor." Patricia Freeman arrived an hour later, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. She was a small woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many years dealing with wildlife emergencies. When she saw Luna, her expression shifted from relief to concern. "She shouldn't be here," Patricia said quietly. "Hospital regulations, insurance liability. Luna needs to come back to the sanctuary with me." "No." The word came out of Jake's mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak. "I mean, with respect, ma'am, I don't think Luna's going anywhere without knowing Ben is okay." As if to underscore his point, Luna had positioned herself directly between Patricia and the hallway leading to the intensive care unit. Her message was unmistakable. She wasn't leaving until she'd completed her mission. Sarah stepped forward diplomatically. "Dr. Freeman, I'm Sarah Clearwater, wildlife specialist with the state. What we witnessed tonight, Luna's behavior was extraordinary. I think we need to reconsider our assumptions about what she needs." Patricia studied Luna with professional assessment. "Ben's been working with her for 6 months. I've been telling him she's too domesticated for release, but he insisted she could bridge wild and tame, said she reminded him of his sons." "His sons?" Sarah asked. "Ben lost 2 boys," Patricia explained, her voice softening. "Michael in Afghanistan, Tommy in that school shooting in Millfield. After Tommy died, Ben threw himself into wildlife work like a man possessed. Luna was supposed to be his masterpiece, a wild animal who could navigate both worlds." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of Tommy's name. "I was Tommy's partner." Patricia's eyes widened. "You're Jake Rivers. Ben's talked about you. He blamed himself for Tommy's death, you know. Thought if he'd been a better father, if he'd steered Tommy away from police work. That's not, Jake began, then stopped. Here was another person carrying guilt that belonged to no one, another family member destroyed by the same tragedy that had broken Jake's life into pieces. A doctor emerged from the ICU, still wearing surgical scrubs. "Are you here for Benjamin Whitehorse?" They all stood at once, even Luna seeming to sense the importance of the moment. "Mr. Whitehorse is stable," the doctor continued. "We've stabilized the fractures in both legs, and while there was some spinal compression, we're cautiously optimistic about his recovery. He's been asking for someone named Luna." Patricia started to explain hospital policies about animals, but the doctor held up a hand. "Ma'am, I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen a patient's vital signs improve just from hearing an animal's name mentioned. If that bobcat helped save his life, then as far as I'm concerned, she's earned the right to say goodbye." They were allowed into Ben's room one at a time. When Jake's turn came, he found the older man propped up in bed, looking fragile but alert. Monitors beeped softly around him, and his legs were elevated in complex braces, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Jake," Ben said, his voice stronger than it had been in the ravine. "Thank you for everything." "Sir, I should be thanking you. What you told me about Tommy. I've been carrying guilt that wasn't mine to carry." Ben nodded slowly. "We've both been carrying ghosts, son. But maybe it's time to let them rest." He paused, studying Jake's face. "Tommy used to say you were the kind of partner who'd walk through fire for people. Tonight you proved him right." "Luna proved him right," Jake corrected. "All I did was follow where she led." "And that," Ben smiled, "took more courage than you know. Most people wouldn't have trusted her. Most people would have called animal control and gone home to their safe lives." When Luna was finally allowed into the room, the transformation in both her and Ben was immediate. She approached his bed cautiously, as if understanding his fragility, and gently placed her front paws on the mattress edge. Ben reached down to stroke her head, and for the first time since Jake had met him, the old man's face was completely at peace. "Good girl," Ben whispered. "You did everything right. Everything I taught you, and more." Luna made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and settled herself on the floor beside his bed. The monitors showed Ben's heart rate and blood pressure immediately improving. "I've made a decision," Ben said, looking at Jake and Sarah. "Luna's not going back to the sanctuary. Not as a rehabilitation project." Patricia stepped forward from the doorway. "Ben, we've discussed this. She can't be released into the wild, and keeping her as a pet would be—" "She's not a pet," Ben interrupted gently. "And she's not wild anymore either. She's something new, something better." He looked at Jake. "Tommy always said the best police officers were the ones who could see solutions that nobody else could imagine. Luna's like that. She sees connections between worlds." Jake felt understanding dawn. "You want her to do search and rescue work." "I want her to save lives," Ben said simply. "The way she saved mine. The way she brought you and me together. The way she's honoring both my boys by being exactly what they would have wanted to become. Someone who helps people." Over the next hour, as storm clouds cleared outside the hospital windows, they worked out a plan that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Luna would become the first certified wildlife search and rescue animal in Tennessee, splitting her time between training with Jake and living at an expanded sanctuary that would serve as an education center. "She'll need a handler," Sarah pointed out practically. "Someone with experience in both law enforcement and animal behavior." Jake looked at Luna, who was still lying faithfully beside Ben's bed, and felt Tommy's presence as clearly as if his young partner were standing in the room with them. "I think I know someone who might be interested in a career change," he said quietly. Ben reached out and took Jake's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Tommy would be proud of both of us tonight. Proud that we found each other, proud that we're giving Luna a chance to keep his spirit alive." As Jake looked around the room, at Ben recovering from his ordeal, at Luna resting peacefully after her heroic night, at Sarah and Patricia planning a future that honored both wild nature and human need, he realized that sometimes the most broken people and animals could create something beautiful together. The guilt he'd carried for 3 years wasn't gone, and probably never would be completely. But for the first time since Tommy's death, Jake felt like he might be worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Tennessee mountains, painting the sky in shades of hope and new beginnings. 6 months later, Jake stood in the morning sunshine outside the newly constructed Tennessee Wildlife Search and Rescue Training Center, watching Luna demonstrate her skills for a group of visiting emergency services personnel. The transformation in both the Bobcat and the facility was remarkable. What had once been a simple wildlife rehabilitation center had evolved into something unprecedented, a bridge between the human and animal worlds that honored the best qualities of both. Luna moved through the search exercise with fluid grace, her golden coat gleaming as she navigated the mock disaster site. She located the hidden victim in under 3 minutes, then sat patiently beside the spot and waited for Jake's signal before approaching. Her training had progressed beyond anyone's expectations, but Jake knew the real magic wasn't in what she'd learned. It was in what she'd always known about loyalty, courage, and the connections that transcend species. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," drawled Sheriff Tom Bradley, shaking his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see the day when a wildcat would be part of my search and rescue team." Jake grinned, adjusting the radio on his utility belt. He'd traded his school bus driver's uniform for search and rescue gear 6 months ago, and every morning he woke up feeling like he was finally doing what he was meant to do. "She's full of surprises, Sheriff. We both are." Ben Whitehorse approached slowly, still using a walking stick but moving with determined independence. The doctors had said he'd never walk normally again, but Ben had proven them wrong through sheer stubborn will and Luna's constant encouragement. Every day during his physical therapy, the Bobcat had been there, offering silent support and motivation. "How's our girl doing today?" Ben asked, pride evident in his voice as he watched Luna complete her demonstration. "Perfect as always," Jake replied. 3 successful searches this week, and the K9 units are asking if we can train more animals like her. The success of Luna's program had attracted attention from across the region. Emergency services departments were fascinated by the concept of using rehabilitated wildlife for search and rescue operations. Luna's unique combination of wild instincts and human bonding had proven invaluable in terrain where traditional search dogs struggled. Sarah Clearwater emerged from the training center's main building, carrying a clipboard and wearing the easy smile that had become familiar to Jake over the past months. Their professional partnership had gradually evolved into something deeper, built on shared respect and the extraordinary experiences they'd weathered together. "The documentary crew wants to do their interview with you and Luna in about an hour," she told Jake. National Geographic is calling this story "When Wild Hearts Save Human Lives." Jake nodded, though he still felt uncomfortable with the media attention. The story of Luna's rescue had captured national imagination, but for Jake it remained deeply personal. This wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about honoring Tommy's memory and Ben's faith, and giving Luna the purpose she'd always been meant to have. Dr. Patricia Freeman joined their group carrying a folder full of official documents. "I just got confirmation from the state," she announced. Luna's certification is complete. She's now officially the first wildlife search and rescue specialist in Tennessee state history. The small crowd that had gathered for the demonstration applauded, but Jake was watching Luna herself. The bobcat had finished her exercise and was sitting calmly beside the mock victim, her intelligent eyes scanning the group of humans as if assessing their reaction to her performance. "You know what Tommy used to say?" Ben said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. He'd say, "Dad, love ain't about holding on tight. It's about letting go and trusting it'll come back when it's supposed to." He looked at Luna with unmistakable affection. "I thought I was training her to survive in the wild. Turns out she was training me to survive losing my boys." Jake felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Ben talked about Tommy. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed from something that isolated him into something that connected him to others who understood loss and healing. A young boy in the crowd, maybe 8 years old, raised his hand. "Mister, is Luna really wild?" Jake knelt down to the child's level, considering the question seriously. "You know, son, I think Luna's something even better than wild. She's chosen to be part of our family while keeping all the best parts of what made her special in the first place." The boy's eyes widened. "Like a superhero?" "Exactly, like a superhero," Jake confirmed, and the simplicity of the child's understanding made him smile. As the crowd began to disperse, Jake found himself alone with Luna for a few moments. She approached him with the easy confidence of a partner, not a pet, and sat beside his feet in the way she'd done hundreds of times over the past months. "Good work today, girl," he said, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. "Tommy would be proud of both of us." Luna made the soft chirping sound that was her version of conversation, then looked toward the memorial wall that had been erected near the training center's entrance. Bronze plaques honored fallen emergency responders from across the region, but the centerpiece was a beautiful engraving of Tommy Whitehorse in his police uniform, with the inscription, "He taught us that courage is loving someone enough to risk everything for their safety." Below Tommy's plaque was a smaller one dedicated to Michael Whitehorse, with his army portrait and the words, "A soldier's heart beats in service to others, even after the battle ends." Luna had developed a ritual of visiting the memorial every morning and evening, sitting quietly for a few minutes as if paying her respects. Jake had never trained her to do this. It was something she'd started on her own, another example of her uncanny ability to understand things that went beyond simple animal behavior. "You know something, Luna?" Jake said as they walked toward the memorial together. "I spent 3 years thinking I'd failed Tommy by not being in the right place at the right time. But maybe the right place was always going to be here with you and Ben, doing this work that honors his memory." As they reached the memorial wall, Jake noticed someone had left fresh wildflowers beneath both plaques, mountain laurel and wild roses, the kind that grew naturally in the Tennessee hills. Ben's work, most likely, though the old man never mentioned his daily visits to the memorial. Luna settled herself in her usual spot, facing the plaques with the dignity of an honor guard. Jake stood beside her, feeling the presence of the 2 young men whose lives had led to this moment, this place, this unexpected family bound together by loss and love and a shared commitment to helping others. The afternoon sun was warm on his face, and in the distance he could hear Sarah's laughter mixing with Ben's voice as they planned the next phase of the training center's expansion. Soon there would be other animals like Luna, not wild, not domestic, but something new and necessary in a world that desperately needed bridges between different kinds of courage. "You know what they say, son," Ben's voice carried across the courtyard, quoting one of his favorite old sayings. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways, and sometimes he sends a wildcat to save your soul." Jake smiled, watching Luna maintain her vigil beside the memorial. In the gentle mountain breeze, he could almost hear Tommy's voice laughing at the improbable chain of events that had brought them all together. Sometimes, Jake thought, the most important rescues weren't about pulling people out of danger. Sometimes they were about pulling people out of despair, out of isolation, out of the belief that their failures defined them. Luna had rescued Ben from his grief, Ben had rescued Luna from abandonment, and together they'd rescued Jake from 3 years of carrying guilt that had never been his to bear. As the day faded into evening and the first stars appeared over the Tennessee mountains, Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude for the strange, wonderful family that had found each other in the darkness. They were all broken in their own ways. The grieving father, the guilt-ridden ex-cop, and the orphaned Bobcat. But together they'd created something beautiful and purposeful and lasting. "Come on, girl," Jake said finally, as Luna completed her evening remembrance. "Let's go home." And for the first time in years, the word home felt like a promise instead of a memory. Friends, if you've made it this far in Jake and Luna's story, you know what it means to carry burdens that feel too heavy to bear alone. Like Jake, many of us have walked through seasons where guilt whispered lies about our worth, where loss made us question whether we still had purpose left to give. But here's what Luna taught an old cop and a grieving father. Sometimes our greatest failures become the foundation for our most meaningful victories. Jake thought losing Tommy ended his story, but it was really just the beginning of a new chapter where healing happens not through forgetting, but through serving others who need what only we can give. Ben found his reason to keep going not by replacing his sons, but by honoring their memory through love that transcends every boundary we think exists. This little Bobcat showed 3 broken souls that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when the storms hit and refuses to leave you behind. Real happiness isn't the absence of pain. It's finding purpose that makes the pain worthwhile. Discovering that our scars can become someone else's roadmap to hope. What loss in your life taught you the most about love? Have you ever found unexpected family in the most unlikely places? Share your story below. We need to hear it.